American history is really defined by waves of immigration. And when we talk about Italian American immigration, we talk about it has been going on for a lot of time, but we really talk about those peak years of immigration. In Columbus, there are records of some Italian Americans here as early as the 1850s, but it was maybe 20 of them. I mean, it was a handful. The peak years of immigration really began in the 1880s with about 300,000 Italian immigrants. That doubled to about 600,000 in the 1890s. And then it really exploded from there, from 1900 to 1920. By 1920, there were 4 million Italian immigrants in the country. So it never stopped, but because of changes in immigration law in the 1940s, which was really part of a backlash against the immigration that was taking place, numbers were reduced. They were never eliminated, but the numbers went down substantially. So for most historians and people looking at waves of immigration, the Italian American really is squarely from 1880 to about 1920 as those peak years.
Well, and the attraction of a place like Ohio was that it was a major industrial state by the late 19th century. Jobs were plentiful, and a lot of the people who arrived from Italy didn't come with big skill sets. Many were from rural areas, probably had worked in farming and that sort of thing. And industrial jobs were pretty good paying compared to what they knew back home.
They were jobs that you could have without necessarily speaking the language. If you were hardworking and were willing to actually be flexible about what you did, there was a huge amount of opportunity. And that time period that we're talking about, 1880 to 1920, that was a period of rapid industrialization in this country. And there was a need for jobs. There was a need for immigrants. So it was a convergence of the need being there and the opportunities and people willing to take them. During that period, most of the immigration really came from the southern half of Italy, which was largely agricultural. Even today is still largely agricultural, definitely poorer than the northern, more industrialized city areas of Italy. So it makes sense. It's the classic immigration story that continues today. It's opportunity, it's freedom, it's the ability to have a say in your destiny if you work hard and if you have a family that you're trying to protect or provide for. There was a huge incentive for people to come and work hard and become a part of this country.
Well, and your family is an example. The relatives on your side arrived as early as, I think it was 1883.
My great-grandparents on my mother's side came in the 1880s, and my father, as a 7-year-old, arrived in 1927. So they absolutely spanned that entire period.
I've always felt that the one on my father's side it was very unique, interesting, and so I questioned it and tried to learn as much as I could about it. But my grandfather was born Ermogino Saturnino Carfagna. Saturnino was the name that stuck with him. As he came to this country, they shortened it to Sam. But while he was in Italy as a young man, he was in the Italian army fighting in World War I on the Austrian front. I believe it was the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. And he was a cavaliere, which is a cavalryman on horseback. And incidentally, I have his medals, which is true to my heart when he was discharged. But he was captured. He was bombed. From what I understand, he told me that there were dirigibles that would throw and drop basically grenades, type bombs. And shrapnel got into his leg. He was wounded. He was captured. He was brought to Germany, and he served 2 years in a German concentration camp, okay? But the story gets better because it wasn't World War II, the Holocaust. He was slave labor. He was a farmer from a little town of Vasto Girardi, which today only boasts 600 people and inhabitants. So it's a very small town. And it's in the hills of Molise, which is in the central of Italy. Say the mountain region. Anyhow, he was captured, and he was every morning for the first year, they would come to the camp and they would select men to go work the fields. And he was one. And after year 2, he told me that he was a trustee and he was allowed to live on the farm with the farmer and the family. And by the end of the war, he was eating at their table and sleeping in their house. And the war ended. Was freed. The man asked him to stay and marry his daughter. And for whatever reason, he said no, and he went back to Vaso Girardi, where my grandmother, Maria Magnaca, was not really waiting for him. But like many stories that I think many of us share, is that marriages were arranged quite a bit at that time. And she was told that she should marry Saturnino Carfagna because he's a very hardworking man and upstanding and all of the good things, right? And he'll take care of you and support you. And that's what happened. And so he has a brother who left and came to the United States and quickly summoned him and said, I got work in this place, Columbus, Ohio, at a packing house called Columbus Meats, which later became David Davies and I think Swift, and then finally it closed down, as a lot of the meatpacking companies across the country did. But so he came. He left my grandmother pregnant with their first child, Lucia, named after, like most Italians, a family name, his father, Luciano. And so Maria and Lucia stayed behind for 2 years. And he worked to gather money, and he came back for 6 months. Left her pregnant again, this time with Filomena. And both of my aunts, or Z, they came here with her. He came back 2 more years. And it was more of a hardship to make enough money to travel like that by ship. So he worked another 2 years. All along, he was banking as much as he could. Went back, left her pregnant again, came back again, okay? And this time it was more like 5 years. And he had bought a farm in New Albany, Ohio, a small farm. And he had sent for her and the children and his mother-in-law. So they came. They lived on this farm. It had no running water. It had no electricity. And my father was the first to be born there, okay? And his name is Eduardo. So there was Lucia, Filomena. Adamo was the first son born in Italy. He was 5 years old when he came. And then later, there was the final child was my aunt, Maria Gina. We call her Mary Jean. So my grandfather had this piece of land, and he's still working. And it's pretty interesting because Roosevelt had the Great Deal. Okay, this was in the mid-1930s after the Great Depression, and the New Deal, not the Great Deal. The New Deal was to bring, public works, and the government was going to invest money into the infrastructure, and they were offering very low to no interest loans to the farming communities to electrify and modernize. And this is how we got into the grocery business. He had saved, he had banked some money, and he had taken some of the money and a bit of the loan, if not as much as he could, and bought a store, a grocery store. He bought, we called it aptly Cleve Meats, as he knew how the butchering business went. And it was at the corner of Core and Cleveland, 1 block south of Hudson Street on Cleveland Avenue, which was the north end of Columbus at the time, and sprawling at that point. And that's where he started. He also bought, there was a home attached to it and above it. And that's where they moved to, and they lived there. He kept the farm. My Uncle Adam would farm it, and then the livestock, they raised some livestock. He World War II finally broke out, and he went to work part-time at Curtis Wright, and I believe they were at Port Columbus at the time. And he was a foreman on the wing, I guess, construction. And it's amazing because I'm 67, but when I was younger, let's say in my 30s, there was a woman who worked for us that was one of the riveters worked with him at Curtis Wright, and I thought that was pretty interesting as well. World War II. So World War II, towards the end, took my Uncle Adam. He was drafted, so he had to sell the farms. He sold the farm in New Albany. He did purchase a farm in Marengo for eggs and chickens. And he opened, behind this market, a poultry business as well, where they would take live chickens, you would pick them out, and you would, and they would slaughter them and defeather them and clean them for you right then and there. And my father told me, he said, Sam, it was the dirtiest job I've ever had to do in my life, you know? And he says that it was so poor at that time. He said the women would actually feel up the chicken to see if there was an egg and say, don't break that egg, when he would have to clean dress the chicken, so to speak. And anyhow, my father and my Uncle Adam took the reign of the business next step further, and they moved it up to the north end of Columbus, Ohio, up onto 161, Route 161 in 71. And that sprawled for 50 years. And then my brother and I aptly bought and have operated the business for the last 20 plus years. Okay, so that's our story. But I've always felt that it was his story, and the way he came here, and what he's gone through. And we often talk of the great generations, and I really do think that those men that fought in the world wars were some of the greatest generations we'll ever read about. And he was one. Mm-hmm.
My heritage is both Northern Italian and Southern Italian. My father came from Northern Italian, a little town called San Giovanni di Casarsa, which is north of Venice. My mother's parents came from a city near Foggia in Italy called San Rosito, Valfattore, and they both have interesting stories about how they came to America. Obviously, I was born here, but my father was born in 1903, so they were farmers, and when the First World War came along, he was a teenager, and it was when Germany took over northern Italy. So his family was prisoners of the Germans. The Germans lived in their house. They had to live in the barns. And my father was a very big man, and he was a teenager, but they thought he was much older. And every morning the Germans would take him behind their lines and showed him how to repair tanks and trucks and all kind of mechanical equipment. So all that he knew about mechanics, he learned from the Germans. So he has kind of a nice view of what Germany did during the war. But eventually, of course, the war ended, and he and seven, there were 8 of them together, 7 buddies, decided they didn't want to be farmers and live in Italy, in the farm country, the rest of their life. They wanted to come to America, which, of course, everybody did at that point. And so his mother and father said he could come, and then on the day he was supposed to join up with his buddies, they were going to stop and pick him up. The grandfather said, no, you can't go, and I'm not giving you the money. And he was very upset, and he waited to tell them he couldn't come. And his mother said, here's the money, go, it's better for you. So anyway, the 8 of them got to Le Havre in France, got the ship, and came to what they said was Canada, is where they were going. But when the ship docked in New York one night, before they got to Canada the next day, they were, of course, down on the very bottom of the ship, and they were hearing what they thought was gunfire. And they said, oh my God, we came all the way to the United States and now there's war here too. Well, it was Armistice Day and these were fireworks. So they invited them up to the top deck and they got to see the fireworks. And then one of the guys said, you know what? I've got the name and address of somebody from our town that ended up in Columbus, Ohio. Rather than go to Canada, why don't we go to Columbus, Ohio? If we like it, we'll stay there. If we don't, we'll go to Canada. That's how he came to Columbus, Ohio. So that's his story. He did become a boilermaker for the Pennsylvania Railroad, eventually started out as a water boy. That's how he got to know your grandfather. Anyway, for construction work and all of that. And then he talked to some people and they knew he knew mechanical work and knew about boilermaker and everything. And he ended up at the Pennsylvania Railroad and become really one of their chief boilermakers. And then he and 6 of the guys that came with him, they decided to open a grocery store, which they did on St. Clair Avenue. And he worked there on Saturdays, worked at the Pennsylvania Railroad as the boilermaker. He became the chief boilermaker. Unfortunately, back in those days, there was a bit of a discrimination, and he was never promoted. But I can well remember the head of the department would come to our house eventually when we were little kids and talk to my father about who should be promoted in the department and how to run the department and everything. But my father knew he would never be promoted because he was an immigrant. So anyway, he retired eventually because the steam engines came in. You didn't need Boilermakers anymore. And then he went to work in construction for Atlas Construction. You knew well, Gino Testa and all that bunch. And then he retired from there eventually. So that's his side of the story. So he was in Columbus, Ohio. My mother's parents decided to come to America because my grandmother's brother had come to America and started working for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Pennsylvania. And he was a pretty smart guy, and they decided to have him learn English, and then they would send him back to Italy to recruit Italian young men to come to work for the railroad. So he obviously recruited his sister's husband to come here. And the two of them, with a little boy who was 5 years old, went from this side of Italy to Naples to get to the ship to come to America. And the way they got from there to there, there were no trains, there were no cars, there were no airplanes, there was nothing. So they went on foot and also on horse-drawn carts that they would go from farm to farm till they finally got to Naples, got the ship, came to America, and of course, he got a job with the railroad, and they kept moving from Pennsylvania to West Virginia and then to Columbus, and that's how they ended up in Columbus.
Awesome.
So that's their story.
Well, my story is a little different because my paternal grandparents were from, and I just recently found this out. They were from Campobasso, which is now in Molise, but back then it was still Abruzzo.
That's right.
And the Sabato side of the family I recently met while in a visit to a little town called Castel di Sal.
Sure, my mother's
Beautiful.
family is from.
What's that?
Sure, my mother's family is from.
Small world. But my paternal grandfather or grandmother passed away before I was born, and I was born in 1940. I'm 83 years old, so I didn't get to know her at all. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, I only knew briefly because he died shortly after I was a toddler. But he was a shoemaker and did very well. Lived on Goodale Street. Goodale Street was like Broad Street or High Street back then. That's how the Flytown area became very popular. And Flytown it was where all the immigrants seemed to end up, like in Flytown. The reason that it came up with the name Flytown is that the building was so rapid at that time. The houses were flying up. And another story thinking about Flytown was that there were so many people coming into Columbus, all the immigrants from all over Europe, and primarily because the fascist in Europe was rampant. So they wanted to get away from that, and America was the place to come. So they ended up in this Flytown area, whether you were Greek or Czechoslovakian or Italian, didn't make any difference. They all ended up in Flytown. But the Italians kind of took over. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, um, uh, when he came from Salerno, which is in the southern part of Italy, closer to Naples. Sorrento, Salerno are like sister cities. He came over in the late 1800s. He was a relatively prosperous teenager at the time, or at least his family was. He came over and married. He met my grandmother here. She was from Campobasso. They married here, started a family immediately, as many Europeans did back then. But she had 4 daughters right away, right, like stair steps. My mother being one of them. And then my grandmother passed away. Oh no, I'm sorry. She had 4 daughters. Then she had 5 sons. They wanted to have a boy, so they had a boy finally, and then 4 more came along. So they had 9 kids. Well, then my grandmother passed away very young. She passed away in 1938, I believe, before I was born. And my grandfather, being as prosperous as he was, thought, well, I have a daughter old enough to babysit her brother. And then as the boys came, each of my aunts had a brother to raise. And that's how he managed to raise 9 kids very successfully. But he was a hardworking man. He opened a small little convenience store. Can't really say it was a grocery store, but it was a convenience store on Delaware Avenue, right in the middle of Flytown. And my brother said, "You're an American now. You speak only English. You don't speak Italian." And when he died, he had no accent whatsoever. He learned the language so perfectly, he never went back to speaking Italian. My mother and her sisters all learned Italian in the grocery store. And there's a wonderful story that we'll get into maybe later, but my mother was in a situation where she helped a gentleman get a driver's license. She worked for the Highway Patrol and the driver's exam station on 17th Avenue. And the man needed a job so bad. And he was pleading, please give me the test so I can learn, so I can have a license to drive. But he couldn't take the written test. He didn't know how to read English. So my mother said, went to the captain, says, can I give him an oral exam in Italian? We can't do that, Lucy. We have to do one. We have to do them oral. She looked at him. She says, he needs a job. She was like the grandmother to all these highway patrolmen. She says, okay, one time. So she gave him the oral exam. He passed it perfectly. He put my mother on a pedestal from that time on. And of course, it was like wildfire in the Italian community. Those who couldn't speak English could go down and ask for Lucy, and she could give you the test in Italian. Well, that didn't last very long. But that's my mother's side of the family. But my father was a true Italian. He had a pool room on Goodale Street that he had for a short while, and then when the Second World War broke out, he wanted to join the army just like everybody else. He couldn't. He had flat feet, and they wouldn't accept him. So he learned how to weld, and he went to work for Jaeger Machine Company, right pretty much where the baseball stadium is Nationwide now. And they were manufacturing cement mixers. And he would volunteer to get inside the mixer and weld the seam. Well, breathing the fumes, welding fumes, he died of lung cancer at 41 years old, leaving my mother and I have an older brother, 9 years older than me. In between, my mother had twins she lost miscarried, and a single she lost at 3 months old. So my brother and I were, my mother was a single mom, couldn't drive. She didn't have a driver's license of her own. But she learned, and she was, when you don't have a father and you lean so much on a mother who was so Italian, you would have thought she was born in Italy, even though she was the ultimate Italian woman, and all of her sisters were the same way. But she raised me with such ideals that I felt like I was born in Italy. When I've been to Italy now 3 times. Every time I go back, I see myself, the people there, I see myself in the people there, because we think differently than the young people today. Even people my age today, if they weren't from a good, European family, those ideals that they taught from those that we all were raised with, you don't see that today, and that's sad. I have 2 sons, and both of them, they have a mother who's half German, or she's full German, she's full blood German. They're half German, but you ask them what nationality they are, and they'll both tell you they're Italian. So, because that's that's not necessarily what I wanted. That's what they picked up. I'm thinking primarily from me, but also from this club, and they're both members of this club. And we all have similar stories. This club, meaning the Columbus Italian Club. I was fortunate to be one of the fellows who started the Columbus Italian Club with Dave Corna, and Tony Penzone. They came up with the idea of starting an Italian club for Italian businessmen of Italian descent. No matter if you're half Italian, or if you have Italian in your heritage, you're welcome to become a member of our club. And with that in mind, we started this club in 1978, and it grew like crazy because our dues were $35 a year. So, but when we realized we got so big so fast, we had 150 members within a month. Well, a couple of months. But then we decided we needed a place of our own, facility. This building that we're in now used to be a little Italian grocery store in Grandview, and we were able to buy it at a decent price, and got it and turned it into what we have today. And our membership went up to as many as 250 people, and we raised the dues to $100 a month and lost half the membership, which is not unusual, from $35 a year to $150 a year. But it's also, from that point on, also continued to grow, and now we have almost 400 members, and a very proud membership. And what's beautiful about this club is we're attracting guys from all over the Midwest, primarily from the northeastern part of Ohio and the western part of Pennsylvania. There are no jobs up there, and they came to Columbus to find work or to go to school. Ohio State being a magnet for young, aggressive kids. So they came to Columbus and fell in love with Columbus, and many of them stayed. But from the Youngstown area, Steubenville, Warren, and then Pittsburgh and all points around Pittsburgh, we have a huge contingent of members from that area. But it's wonderful because they've come to our club with their approach to being raised Italian. They brought winemaking and introduced it to a lot of our members. Now, my youngest son, is one of the winemakers. He's in his 4th year of making wines, and they make incredibly good wines. They also bring, the recipes from their grandparents and their parents. So we have a dinner here once a year, at least once a year, where it's a potluck, and you bring what you know how to cook, that from your Italian heritage, and it's wonderful to see some of these dishes that come that I like. My gosh, where you been? Teach me this recipe. I love to cook, and this is I love to see all these wonderful recipes. And thanks to Carfagna's now gives us a wonderful store to shop at, and the imported foods that you're carrying in the store is just phenomenal. I was able to. Our last visit was just this past summer into Italy. We started in Tuscany and then went down to southern Italy. We were able to stay on a farm in Tuscany that couldn't speak English, and we couldn't speak Italian. We had no problem conversing. They just accepted us like you can't believe. They're hungry for Americans to come over and enjoy their Italian ways. And we had a group of 13 of us, and we couldn't have accepted it any more than we did. And then we went down and spent over a week in southern Italy and in the Salerno and Sorrento area and the Amalfi Coast, and that was beautiful as well. Yeah. When my father died in 1950, I needed a job. I got a job at the Columbus Zoo because my brother had worked his way from parking lot attendant all the way up to being the director of the Columbus Zoo. He unfortunately left Columbus to go to San Antonio, Texas, and became the director of the San Antonio Zoo for the last 30-some years. But he gave me a job that I had at the zoo, and I vowed I would once have a white-collar job because shoveling monkey manure was not my way to that's not the way I was raised. So, but a friend of mine talked me into visiting a beauty school that had 150 girls, and I thought my chances were pretty decent. So I became a hairdresser and met my current wife, who was a hairstylist as well, and met her in a salon that I purchased with Charles Pinzo. So, but we have a wonderful life, and my boys are enjoying being Italian. So that's my story.
My colleagues here talked about how their families got to Columbus. So I wanted to tell you about how my father's family got here to Columbus. It's kind of interesting. Really, the hero of my father's family is my grandmother, probably most other people. My grandfather, like the others, he came over here without her, and she had 3 children in Italy. So she came over later and came over steerage, of course, with 3 little children, including a baby. And they landed at Ellis Island. And to get out of Ellis Island, you had to have a certain amount of money, and she didn't have the money. And my grandfather's working in the mines in Lynch, Kentucky. I had to get money to her. She had to travel, not speaking any English, having just barely enough money to get out of Ellis Island, make her way to Lynch, Kentucky, which is in the middle of nowhere. So she got there. So Grandpa was working in the mines, and of course it was during Prohibition, and he made wine, and he kept it in the creek to keep it cool and to hide it. So one day the revenuers show up at the door, and my grandmother didn't speak English, but my Uncle Pete, you probably remember Pete, he spoke English and Italian, and so he talked to the revenuers, and Mom told him in Italian, "Go let Pop know that the revenuers are here." So Uncle Pete went to the mine, got the word down through the Italians that, hey, the revenuers are here. Giuseppe, you better clear out. So he took off, and he ran till he wound up in Columbus for some reason. And again, so now my grandmother has 4 children. My father was born in Lynch, Kentucky, and she has to find her way to Columbus, Ohio, which at that time, out of Kentucky, they didn't have roads and things. I mean, you cut through farm fields, and I don't know how in the heck she made it, but that's how our family got to Columbus.
As most families, it was economic. The immigrants from Italy were southern Italy and Sicily, because those were the poor areas. And it's rare that you're going to find somebody from Genoa or Tuscany or Venice that immigrated to the United States, because they had jobs and money. And so my family was poor, like almost everybody I know, their family was poor. And my great-grandfather came in 1899 because he had, as the years go on, it gets a little lost, but if it was a friend or a cousin, and we're not sure, and said, come, this is great, Columbus, Ohio, spectacular. And I can't imagine that in 1899. And they came over, and his friends started him. There was a West Market on Gift Street, which is now the Bottoms. And I don't even know if the building still exists, but it was the West Market. We have the Central Market, North Market, West Market, and I think there was a Mohawk Market at one time. And so he got established with a fruit and vegetable retail stand, and then he bought a horse and wagon and started wholesaling. So that's how the family got involved in the wholesale business. He left his wife and 2 sons in Sicily, and it took, I think, 6 years for him to bring his family here. And my grandfather was the oldest son, and his name was Giuseppe, which he became Joe, and his second oldest son was Giuliano, who became Julian. And they Americanized. My grandfather my grandfather started peddling as soon as he came here. I think he was 12 and peddling lemons and oranges to the bars up and down High Street. His dad would give him a big knapsack and he'd carry him. Now you got to realize his Army discharge paper said he was 5'3.5", 160 pounds.
All right. From what I understand, it was my grandfather that things were very rough in Italy, where he was from, which was from Calabria, which is the tip of the boot of the beautiful shape of Italy. And he was the first of his family in Italy to come to America. And we're looking at the year about 1916, something to that effect. And he came over to, like so many, he was a little bit older person. At that time, he wasn't a child. He was like late teens, early 20s. And looked how everything would be in America, what it would be like. And he started to search what his jobs would be so that he could send money back home. And then later on, the entire family, his brother and other members of the family came to America. That was my fraternal father's grandfather, or my fraternal father's father. On my mother's side, it was interesting because my grandparents were born in Columbus, Ohio. So my great-grandparents, again from the Abruzzi region, Guadraiege, were one of the, and Tradacqua, those are the areas my grandparents were from. But my grandparents and my mother and father born here. So that's kind of cool. So I'm 2nd generation on one side and 3rd generation on another. And again, it was that whole financial problems that were happening. And so they came here and looked for work. When I said about here, my grandfather on my fraternal side actually went to Lynch, Kentucky, and was a coal miner. Interesting enough, we're watching WOSU back in the 90s. They have this wonderful vintage show about the coal miners. And there's my grandfather in this picture. He had been dead some 40 years by that time, and there he was. So that was pretty shocking and exciting to see. But he was the fabric of the Italian community and the first one. My other side, they were the Central Market. They were the fruit people. Central Market, North Market is where my grandmother sold bananas. My family had fruit stands, and my grandfather, seeing all this, decided he was going to work in a bakery as a very small boy, and ended up having one of the largest bakeries at that time, Seymour Bakery, Giantonio's, in Columbus, Ohio. So just cool things that would happen in your family.
Both grandparents came over at the turn of the century. My grandfathers both came first and then brought their families over after they earned money to bring them over. my paternal grandfather was an orphan, so there wasn't a whole lot of history that we could track down on him. And his wife, my grandmother, passed away right after they immigrated to Columbus. My maternal grandparents were from Sicily, and in talking with Grandpa many times, in his broken English, he would tell me that the reason they came to the United States was that their town, their village was so poor in the mountains near Palermo that they ate dirt, were his words. So he came here for a better life for his family. Mom's parents ended up living with mom as she was the youngest of 7 children. And in an Italian home, she would be responsible for taking care of her parents and make them comfortable. So I grew up with them in the same house.
On my side, my maternal grandparents both immigrated to the United States from Italy. My grandfather, he came from the Abruzzo region of Italy, and my grandmother from Tuscany. My grandmother had previously married and lived in the Marble Cliff area around the quarry, and her husband was killed in a quarry accident. So later she met my grandfather, and his last name was DeSantis of the flower businesses here and around Columbus. And he was the first of his brothers to come to the United States. And many times they would come over, and he originally was coming to the wine country of California and was going to go out and work in a vineyard. And as they only had enough money to get into the United States and then start to work their way across the country. So he stopped in a few places, and he knew some people from Abruzzo that were in Columbus, and he ended up stopping in Columbus and worked for a landscape company. And in that, he learned the business, enjoyed it, and he started Linden Florist, which was in the predominantly Italian area of Columbus at that time. And he enabled his brothers to come over. Nick opened up DeSantis Florist on High Street in the Clintonville area, and his brother Pat opened up DeSantis Florist on Henderson Road. On my father's side, my grandfather was from Alvito, which was just south of Rome. And he immigrated originally with his father to England. And then from England, they came over to the United States. And it was the same type of thing. They ended up in Columbus quite by accident. There were so many people from Alvito already here, and they all got in the construction business. So you had the Sinicola family, the Guzzo family, the Galucci's, the Tatas, the Aramos, and the Connies. And much of the infrastructure that's in Columbus today, typically your sewage or your water is all from pipes that they installed 100 years ago, which is kind of neat. They came over primarily because the economy was so bad. You just had the Great Depression here in the United States, and it trickled over into Europe. They came for a better life, and they were also trying to escape the fascism and socialism that was taking place there in Europe at that time, and predominantly Italy and Germany.
Yeah, I could tell you a couple stories. Again, I know more about my mother's side because we lived with her parents. Grandpa would always tell me about the stories. First of all, both grandfathers worked for the railroad. There were pockets in central Ohio where the Italians ended up congregating. One was at the railroad yards in the Milo Grogan area, which was a block from our house. The other were, as Jack said, the quarries on the west side of Columbus. And there was a third area called the Flytown near St. Francis, which is now St. Francis off of Buttles Avenue. So in those areas, when Grandpa first got here and was looking for employment, he ended up with the railroad. He did not know English, of course, so they gave him the job of stenciling the numbers on the boxcars. My dad's dad had a little bit of woodworking skills, and he ended up replacing the floorboards in the refrigerator cars, which were always rotting out because of the moisture of the water from the ice and what have you. So they both worked on the railroad.
We always had, the big holiday meals. And I guess about 30 years ago, so I was probably still in college, I sat down with my grandmother and actually cooked with her and learned all of her recipes and documented all the recipes. So I actually have those today. And I'll have Thanksgiving at my house and I'll cook. And any other times I can get my kids to come back to Ohio, I'll cook the meal for everybody. And I've kind of done the same thing with my kids. I won't give them the recipes. They have to sit there and cook with me. So now they have them. They've learned them. I have had cousins reach out and want some pizzelles, which is an Italian cookie. My grandmother's recipe was the best. And I'll actually ask them how much they want to make and make it for them and give it to them because they haven't sat down with me to learn the recipe. So that was always special. The meals, just going to church on Sundays, because as a young person, I went to St. John's with my mom and dad and my brother. We did catechism classes there, and it was always an event because the Mass was beautiful. Father Maripez, who said the Mass, gave amazing homilies. And then there was such a family unity within the parish itself. You would go down into the basement after Mass, and the parents would typically have coffee and donuts while the kids were at their classes. And just walking back at that time to get a cup of coffee, the men would go into this little room with a curtain that was drawn, and it was strictly the men that were allowed in there. They would put some money into a little cigar box, and there would be a little bit of liquor, and you'd pour a shot into your coffee. And it was like a scene out of The Sopranos. And it was just, those were just great memories. And the other thing I can remember too is the creation of the Columbus Italian Festival. My father was very, very active in the parish. He was a past chairman, as you were. And, that when that came around in October at that time, it was a big 2-week project. And everybody that was in the construction business, Italians in Central Ohio, donated their equipment or their crews to go over and get everything set up. At the time, I think it was in the Lauschie building on the fairgrounds. And so just to be able to see that grow to become the event that it is today and how it contributes to Columbus. I mean, there's so many people that come in from all over the country just for that event, and they'll be at church on Sundays at St. John's because of that.
There were two groups in particular, men, of course, but sometimes single men would come and work for a period of time, earn money, send it back to Italy. And at that time, with the exchange rate, if you were making money in an industrial job here in the United States, you sent money back to Italy, you were sending a lot of money back. And you could have actually built up a nest egg for the future. So it was not uncommon for some people to come for a period of time and then go back and settle down in Italy. Others, and my grandfather's an example, he came as a married man with his family still in Italy, sent money back, and 5 years later, his family joined him when he was established, when he had enough income to have a house. And then there were people, professionals, who would come. That happened for sure. And it was really a mixed bag. There's every immigrant you would ever talk to in history would have a personal story, although there are common themes that certainly get repeated over and over again. The immigrant experience, I don't think has changed that much. It's a mixed bag. I think now of people who left their country and their families and what they knew, and they didn't know if they'd ever go back. And that, to me, shows how much people had optimism, how they believed in the future, how they believed in themselves, and how they were willing sometimes to sacrifice for the good of their families. But it could be a mixed bag. There was certainly opportunity here. And I think if you talk to anybody who is from a family that came to the United States during the time period we're talking about, we're all better off as a result of it. There's no question, because of the opportunity that was provided. But there was also discrimination. It's not unlike today. Were they taking jobs from people who were already here, or were they less desirable than the people who were already here? And there was a problem at the time, because a lot of Southern Europeans were seen as literally less desirable than the Northern Europeans who had come earlier. They had the aspect of being largely Catholic, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment at the time too. So there could be discrimination. On the other hand, a lot of people came and moved into ethnic neighborhoods and found a real sense of community. They found churches where their language was spoken. They felt like they found a landing place. I remember my grandfather, though, talking about wanting to assimilate as quickly as possible. So there was that constant tension of a culture and an identity that, in my experience, and I think this probably was true, was shared among Italian Americans, that family was Italian culture. Your place in the world was assimilation. And that certainly happened. And I saw it play out in my family. But I think a mixed bag of experiences, but overall, I would say a positive experience, because they got here. And that was a big deal.
And these immigrants, they might arrive and do whatever they had to do to make a living to begin with, but they had economic aspirations as well. And again, Nancy's family is an example. Her maternal grandfather came and worked on the railroad gang, and then ran the ice plant in Steubenville, and then he got into the automobile business within a few years of arriving. On her father's side, her grandfather became a skilled machinist.
In a steel mill.
In a steel mill.
Yeah.
And was known for his skill in repairing machinery to keep the line from going down and losing production. So the aspirations were sort of multifaceted, and they were patient too. It took several years for your dad and his brother and your grandmother to come from Italy.
Yeah.
And the story we heard was that her paternal grandmother was a little disappointed in what she found in Steubenville. They lived in a nice stone house in Italy, and she was alarmed that everybody in Steubenville lived in a wood house. She'd never heard of that.
I think the traditions that were handed down, I'm sure most of us went to our grandmother's house on Sunday for dinner. Every Sunday we went there, every holiday we were together. And the family is a very important part of the Italian legacy heritage. And I think we all share that, where we were just always around, very respectful, all of the kids and everything. It was interesting. I've been to Italy several times, and my uncle Richie and I went together the first time, and we visited all these family members and everything. So the next time we went, we said, hey, look, let's get a party house and we'll have everybody come here. We'll throw a big party. And this is very typical. There were 4 generations, and the kids didn't leave. They stayed there till 2:00. We had lots and lots of food. Kids weren't on phones. It was all family, and it's a very loving tradition, and family is at the core. Even in America, it's getting a little bit more dissolved as our children marry outside of the Italian legacy. But
we lived with our grandparents. I was 7 years old when my father built his first home, and your Uncle Richie built it, I believe. Yeah. And we moved across the street. So if you ever seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, it was very much my similar situation. So every day we were back across the street. We got off the bus and we didn't go into our home. We went into our nonny's home, and my nonna would come home at 2:00 to eat and go back to the store around 6 and close, where he had his sons there anyhow, my father and my uncle. But that was very, very much a tradition in Italy, was the siesta. You would eat your larger meal early in the afternoon, and then in the evening when you come home, you might have a bite, maybe some salami or pieces of cheese or whatever, a glass of wine. But the larger meal, so we'd get off the school bus, and there it was. You'd run in there because we knew there was a big meal happening. But to your point, every Sunday every holiday. And that's how our cousins were so close. So tradition-wise, when my brother and I, raised families, we decided, and my in-laws, I married into an Italian family, the Cuas, and all of us decided to try to have our children at the same time because we loved the fact that we grew up together, and our best friends mostly were our cousins. So we did, in that tradition. Now our children are having their children at the same time for the same reasons. And it just is so great that family is where it's all centered about. And my father always brought faith into it. Okay. He was super religious and instilled that in us. And we were grateful for that as well. But I do believe, though, that the Italian community, when they talk about socializing, yes, it's family, the food, the center of the table, but also the church. St. John the Baptist has been one stalwart institution for the Italian community for so many, many, many years, and still is. And I do believe that there's so many of us that have, resonated from that church and branched out, whether we moved north, west, east, but from that, so much has evolved. The clubs, the Columbus Italian Club, back there's still the Abruzzi Club and the Venice Club, and that's right, and then GACS, the GAC, the Old Athletic.
That's. I'm glad you brought that up. The GACS is Guild Athletic Club. Was never meant to be an Italian club. It evolved that way because there were more Italians in the neighborhood, and that was right on Goodale Street.
When people leave their homeland and come to a new place, the challenge is, how do you keep part of your identity, but how do you also assimilate and become part of this new place? And one of the things about this country, which is so remarkable, is people have done that from so many different places in the world, and they continue to do it today. So the assimilating was, learning the language, getting a job, getting established, buying a house, starting a business, feeling like you had a place in the world, feeling like you were accepted and you were seen more as an American than an outsider. But traditions die hard. And I think of just traditions in my family. And one of the ones that I still have people telling me about today was Sunday dinner at my parents' house, which was every single Sunday until probably about 2010, when my mother wasn't as well and my mother and father weren't making spaghetti and meatballs every single Sunday. But the idea of checking in with your family and having this extended meal, and if you talk to Italians, they always talk about food. There's even a book named that, Why Italians Always Talk About Food. But it is, as in many cultures, having a meal, sharing food, and sharing kind of that extended family and love is very, very much a part of culture. And one of the other ones, again, around food, and it's more of an Italian-American custom than truly Italian custom, is the Feast of Seven Fishes on Christmas Eve, which is now widely practiced. I mean, the New York Times has 42 recipes for that night, which was not what happened when we were growing up. But those kind of things, holidays, family, baptism, sacraments, baptism, confirmation, first communion, those were all huge events that the entire family would gather. Also with education, because one of the things that people really valued was, even if I don't have skills, I want to make sure the next generation has an education or has opportunity. So graduations have always been huge events. I mean, even like 8th grade graduation was a huge deal. All of those things. And even in Italy today, the national holidays revolve around religious holidays. So Easter is Easter. It's an important holiday. One of the biggest holidays in Italy is the day after Easter, Easter Monday, when everybody goes out and has a picnic somewhere in the mountains, by the water, with family and extended family and friends. So I think those kind of things carried over, which is a little bit of a crossover between kind of secular life and religious life, but they tend to meld in Italian culture. I think of Ferragosto, which is the Assumption, August 15th.
Ferragosto refers to August being the month that Italians take off for vacation. Yep. And food, too, was a pathway to prosperity for a lot of immigrants. You look at the Prezzuti family, the restaurant they had on Fifth Avenue.
And food stores.
Was it the Caroba family? TIT restaurant that's still there on Ames Road and Livingston Avenue.
And a lot of the wholesale fruits and vegetables and markets, Italian markets and food and bakeries. You build what you know, and that became a lot of business people started with that basis. You're right.
Well, and you're seeing it in modern Columbus too, with the strong immigrant flow into Columbus. You're finding food operations for people from various places, from the Himalayas to Africa.
Restaurants, Asian markets, or Latino markets. I mean, the whole thing. So I think it brought, I think waves of immigration have brought a lot of interesting opportunities to learn about other cultures in Columbus. But yeah, I think it's a cycle repeated over and over again.
Yeah, you look at the North Market, for example, or Central Market when it was going until it was torn down in the 60s. And a lot of the vendors there were either in the market itself, but we remember doing research about Columbus markets. And we were surprised to find that Central Market, which was roughly where the Holiday Inn is or the old bus station is going to become a COTA facility, it was right along that west side of 4th Street. And the market was there, but every market day, dozens of people would set up in the streets surrounding. And we had photos of people setting up upside down baskets and big wood trays, and then they'd put their produce out. Some were Italian, some were from other places.
There were a lot of Germans, a lot of people did it. But
there were five horseradish vendors in the Central Market at one point, serving primarily the German population. It's just really interesting how people saw an opportunity. Once they got here, saw an opportunity and took advantage of it, meeting the needs of other people, either like them or from people from the community that they'd moved to.
And starting with those stands, the next step, if you were outdoors, was you frequently went indoors and had a permanent space that was open all week. There were wholesale vendors who also were located in that area, and that was another step. And then setting up markets and stores and having these shops in neighborhoods where people live, that was becoming a business owner, was another aspect of it. And again, the idea of having different vendors for different items that you bought. The North Market is like the perfect representation in a lot of ways of life in Italy today. You go to the one place to get your bread. And if you're a regular, they save it for you and hand it to you as you're walking in the door. You go another place to get fish. You go another place to get meat. You go another place to get homemade pasta. You go someplace else to get dried and cured meats. You go someplace else to get wine. Daily shopping could easily be 10 little shops right next to each other. So that was such an easy thing for them to actually come and do here. And we've gotten away with that with supermarkets, but now we see those as these little treasures, these specialty markets.
And it's still very strong in Italy. We've traveled there a fair bit, and that's the experience you have in Italy. The big supermarkets are fairly scarce. It's the individual vendors for specific products.
Think about the boundaries before, let's say, right after the war, right after the Second World War. East to west, you went from the airport to Marble Cliff, was all part of the Italian neighborhood. North and south was from Clintonville to German Village. That's a huge area. But that engulfs that all part of being part of our own little Italy, you know. And then of course what happened then, 71 came through and cut off the whole east side. 315 came through, they're exactly right. 315 came through and cut off the whole west side. And it's sad. You know what's really sad is go to Cleveland and see how incredible that Italian neighborhood is up there, because they have nothing cut them up. Our Italian neighborhood would have been twice that size if the highways hadn't cleared it cleared a way for Columbus to grow, and Columbus had to grow. We don't have a lake or a river to as boundaries, so we're growing in every direction right now, and it's beautiful for our club because we're busting out of our seams in this little operation that we have here.
But you talk about Italian recipes, and our restaurant truly are the recipes my grandmother handed down to us.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're very proud of that. You know, manicotti in the Abruzzo Molise region is made with a crepe shell as opposed to pasta shell. And we carry that tradition on, and some people question, you know, is this pasta? No, it's a crepe, you know, very tender and very popular too. But that was what we grew up with, you know, and yeah, it's wonderful. I can remember, you know, we lived with them, as I mentioned, but we never lived upstairs. We lived in the basement. We were subterranean because the upstairs was covered with plastic. There was a kitchen up there that never got used. There was a living room that we weren't allowed to sit into. And I'm sure we all had those couches with plastic on them that you never were allowed to get into. We stayed downstairs. There was a full kitchen downstairs, a huge table, and a rolling pin this long, and just that was the pasta table.
Oh, yeah.
And she would spend holidays the day before making gnocchi, which is the little potato and farina dumpling by hand, and just keeping them on that table to dry out, and they would just be all over there. And then to cook them, to watch her cook them, it was an art too, because you don't dump them all in there and stir them like you would dry pasta. She had to ladle them in, you know, a handful at a time, and then put them onto the plate, and it was such a treat. But everybody appreciated those because that was always something that we had for Christmas, Easter.
Speaking of traditions and families,
Yeah.
You guys probably had the same situation. I never had a non-relative babysitter. I either went to my grandparents' house or a cousin or an aunt. I had a couple of aunts that weren't married, but never, ever a non-family babysitter.
You know,
or they took us with them, you know, when they would go in the middle of the night, carry us out in the cold.
Sure.
But all the cousins would be together playing, fall asleep on the floor while they're playing cards and stuff. And
our family had my mother and her sisters had a stand on North Market, the original North Market, when it was a Quonset hut, we called them that. But that was they had a produce stand on North Market, and on Saturday night after the day was over, they would take their produce and walk around and trade it with the other vendors for chicken and meat and so on. I mean, that was, and then on Sunday was our feast that we would have at my grandfather's house, because whatever they would barter with the produce was what we would have on Sunday. And then that would be a supplement to my uncles, who were all hunters. And we go out and rabbit hunt and pheasant hunt and quail hunt, and then bring the game in. And my aunt was not married, and she would clean the game, and we'd have, rabbit cooked in sauce is nothing better.
Something else I bet we all have in common. My grandmother was probably 50 years old, but she looked like she was 80 or something. She always wore the grandmother shoes and the hose with the seam, always had on a cotton print dress, and always had an apron on. She was always in the kitchen whenever we stopped by there. But one of the fun things was Grandpa always made wine, and down in the basement where he had his wine stored, she had one of those chairs, the old chairs with the chrome and the linoleum type seat on it. And she had a little glass, and she'd keep in her apron. She'd go down there and sit in that chair and have this little teeny glass of wine. Her little breaks every once in a while. So
I have to tell you a good wine story. And that was something I was going to mention, the fact that there are so many things that are very common in the United States now that really originated with Italians. And when I look at the bocce court here, on St. Clair Avenue, where we had our grocery store, next door was the Venice Club, which was, all the ones from northern Italy. They had 2 bocce courts, and they were the only ones in Columbus. And I mean to tell you, it became very popular. And now bocce is, all over this country. But the wine business was another thing I was going to mention. And you probably all remember when we always knew when the train had come in, because the wooden crates of grapes would be delivered to every one of the houses on the street, and they would be put at the curb.
Yeah.
So everybody was making their wine, and everybody got their delivery of their wooden crates from the railroad to the house. And my father had, of course, the wine press that came from Italy, and the barrels, and we had the cantina in the basement and the whole bit. And I'll just have to tell you a funny story about wine. My mother made me the one to go down and get the pitcher of wine for my father for dinner. And I was pretty stupid, but I would take the pitcher down there, fill it up, and then I would drink from the side of the pitcher. And I would come up. My mother said, "You better quit drinking wine." I didn't drink any wine. And finally she told me, "It's on your face. You've got a mustache. Don't lie to me." So I got into trouble there. But, that was just, everybody made their wine. I mean, everybody got the grapes delivered from the Pennsylvania Railroad and parked at the curb, and you had your wine press and you made your wine.
That's kind of, it was interesting. My son and a group of fellows in our club decided to start making wine. And a couple of the fellows from the Pittsburgh area brought the idea to the club, let's make wine. Well, they decided now you can buy juice. You can buy a 5-gallon bucket of juice. And they said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to make wine from grapes. So one of the fellows, one of my best friends, is from Warren, Ohio. And he brought to Columbus his father's press. Well, he's finally finished making wines, and he says, I can't give up this press. I'm not going to give it away. I wanted somebody to have it that can use it. And these fellows all got together and, pooled their money, and they bought the press, and they were making some of the best wines I've ever tasted because they're making them from scratch. Absolutely from scratch.
Got a wine story and a bocce story. Talking about bocce, I lived in San Francisco in the late 60s. And Golden Gate Park is a beautiful big park, and they have all kind of things going on there. So I would walk through the park, and you got to the part where there was the lawn bowling. Everybody was in whites. Nobody was saying a word. Go a little bit further, there were the bocce courts. There were all the old Italian guys in their Italian tees, baggy shorts, yelling and screaming and having a ball and everything. Yeah. And the wine, of course, when you go to Italy, no matter how young the children are, they ask, do you want to serve them wine? They'll put wine glasses in front of them, and, it's just part of the culture.
Yeah. We always made wine at my grandfather's home. And those Italians back in that day, they squeezed every last drop out of that grape. Well, to make great wine today, you realize that, you have to have a light pressing because there's all the astringencies and bitterness comes from that seed and the skin content. Okay. So my uncle was a burly guy, strong. And my grandfather would be on the backside coaching, squeeze it, my son of my feet, just squeeze it, my son of my feet. And he squeezed, all of a sudden, crack with his staves. And he goes, no, stop. But we laughed so much about that story because they wanted to get every last drop. They fluff it up and then squeeze it again, and the wine. I mean, you always remember the homemade wines and that, but they'd put it in a 55-gallon drum and it would last them months and it would oxidize. Mm-hmm. And as we, as I learned winemaking and modern winemaking, I guess you would call it, is that, I realized that they weren't really drinking good wine, you know what I mean? The alcohol was still there, but...
some of it was awful.
Yeah.
I have a good friend of mine who makes wine. He and his son make wine every year. And we were talking one day, and he says, by the way, don't buy red wine vinegar. He says, Well, I've got half a barrel that went bad. Makes the best vinegar you've ever had in your life.
Speaking of, you guys all know my Uncle Richie. He was a hustler from the time he was a little kid. They had no money, so those kids had to just do what they could to get money. And they lived on 2nd Avenue, and the railroad tracks were nearby. And during the Depression, there were always a lot of hobos around. And Uncle Richie used to fill jelly jars and pass them through the basement window to these hobos. So one day, this hobo is bent over, and Uncle Richie's got the jelly jar of wine, and here comes Pops. And so the hobo took off and grabbed Uncle Richie by the arm and pulled him out of the basement right through the window and beat the hell out of him. He was just a little kid.
The one aspect, the social aspect of being an immigrant or being the descendant of one is people coming together for fun, for recreation, for sharing culture. And clubs became a way to do that. And in Columbus, over a period of time, these social clubs were established. I know my grandparents belonged to the Piave Club, which was one of the clubs that was very much involved with the Columbus statue and the gift from Genoa. But these were, they had an Italian golf club, and they had, some that were more religious. They had some that did social work or, volunteer work. But a lot of them were just purely social, where they developed friendships, where they developed business contacts. And that was a really important part of it. That networking became part of this community that supported each other in so many different ways. And at the time the Columbus statue was erected, there were 30 of these clubs in Columbus. So that's quite a considerable number. I don't know how many members they had, but just the fact that there were 30 different ones kind of amazed me. There were 2 churches that were known to be Italian American, but otherwise it was less churches and more the social clubs. The whole idea of the Christopher Columbus statue and that identification of it with Italian Americans and that sense of pride that they had for Christopher Columbus is kind of interesting, because Columbus has been part of this country's origin story, if we want to call it that, for centuries. Mm-hmm. It didn't just start, for centuries. We all went to school and learned that Columbus discovered America, as though nothing existed here before that, and as though he actually sailed up the Scioto River. He never stepped foot in North America, but that's another thing. The District of Columbia. When you hear Columbia is the feminine version of Columbus. So the District of Columbia, the city's named after Columbus. The World's Fair in Chicago in 1892, the World's Columbian Exposition was celebrating.
The United States was almost called Columbia.
Yes, it was.
There was a movement back in the 18th century when we were getting set up. There were a number of people who wanted to call it Columbia.
So, that idea of Columbus being a celebrated figure in American history became an opportunity for Italian Americans. Even though he sailed for Spain, he was from Genoa. He was an Italian explorer. And having somebody who was seen as a hero be also Italian, and you can see if there was discrimination and a lot of this was going on, that would be an opportunity to feel more American, or to maybe be seen as more American because of that connection. Some of the Columbus Day, one of the first celebrations was in New York and San Francisco, that had large Italian populations back 1860s, 1870s. There was a terrible episode in New Orleans that had quite a few Italian immigrants, where there was a lynching after a murder. And even the New York Times had an editorial about how shifty they were. And I mean, it was just, you read some of this today and you understand how horrible that must have felt to read something like that. And yet, we respect the New York Times today. And I was kind of shocked to read that. So that was one of the first sanctioned celebrations, because it was 1892. So that 1492, those 92 years become, marking points.
Well, then you have the whole thing with the organized crime and, Elliot Ness fighting the Italian mob in Chicago and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of myth that swirls around, a lot of assumption about what Italian Americans are up to, that sort of thing. I guess it comes with any group you're not familiar with. You sort of make assumptions about people that aren't necessarily and usually are simply not true.
I think it was something that embarrassed me growing up, that everybody thought if you were Italian, you had to be mafia. And it was like, stereotypes die hard. Even today, on television, that happens. But going back to the idea of Christopher Columbus. So the period of 1955, it was so different in the United States than it was in Italy at that time. We were the victors in World War II. War did not take place on our soil, on our land. We didn't see destruction that happened and displacement and just what people suffered and went through. Italy was just recovering from the war in 1955. And here we were. We had a booming economy at that time. We had a population boom at that time. We had suburbs being built. That was not the case in much of Europe. And during the war, Italy suffered tremendously from bombing, first from Allied forces invading Italy, later by retreating Germans who were, after the liberation, they really extracted a lot of pain as they left. They did not leave willingly. But what was interesting was by the time Italy was liberated in 1944, they welcomed the Allies. They wanted to be out from under a fascist Mussolini government. They saw where it led. And that kind of changed attitudes about it. But probably the defining thing that this country did at the end of World War II that I don't think had ever been done in history was the idea of the Marshall Plan, where we as a country actually invested what today would be many billions of dollars in rebuilding countries. Most of the money went to Germany, Italy, and France to actually help them rebuild. But to help rebuild the country of your former enemy was unprecedented. Instead of claiming land, we actually helped. And in Italy, between about 1948 and 1952, there were about 15,000 projects in Italy funded by American dollars. And it helped to rebuild the infrastructure, reinvest in the railroads and roads. And one of the biggest things, because it really impacted people in rural areas, was tractor sales. And this sounds like nothing, so we sold tractors. Agriculture was 19th century agriculture, even at the start of World War II. They didn't have machinery. It wasn't updated. It wasn't as productive as it could be. So the investment really impacted people no matter where they lived. It was rural areas. It was cities. It was transportation. And the idea that the city, Genoa, and this idea that there's a city named Columbus in the U.S. and that opportunity to have a people-to-people kind of relationship was something that Sister Cities was really promoting. And Genoa became Columbus's first sister city in 1955. But in looking at this a little more carefully, it was interesting to see at the time Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and he was very supportive of any people-to-people kind of activity, whatever it was, program activity, because he really believed if people reached out across borders to try to understand a culture or a different people, that we would be less inclined to want to go to war. History will maybe prove that it hasn't been as successful as one would hope, but I think there was a sense of optimism, a sense of relief that the war was over and it worked out the way that it did. And I think a sense of being grateful. So the idea of a gift to a city and that it was a big deal in this city. And you can imagine those 30 Italian American organizations who were involved in the celebration. It was a multi-day celebration, how they finally felt like they were, they were really assimilated now because this great thing was happening and 100,000 people attended it. It's easy to understand why people were proud of that. We know so much more about Columbus today than we did then. And I think your experience and your history and your culture could look at that through a different lens. And I think that the thing about history is the more we learn, the more we have an opportunity to understand. And understanding where it came from and how people might look at it today might be a challenge, but it also could move us forward into understanding different viewpoints and different experiences. I can speak to my experience. I can't speak to anybody else's. And it's interesting to hear other people tell their stories of their families or their traditions or their grandparents, great-grandparents, forefathers, whatever. I think Italian American heritage is still alive and well in Columbus. It might be different than it was in 1920. I think it's still alive and well in families, in community. There's still organizations that celebrate that heritage. I think the Italian Festival, and I don't remember exactly when it started, it was in the 1980s. But the Italian Festival, I know people today who still go, and we know young people who are still learning traditional dances and they celebrate. It's like, Irish dancing or, Oktoberfest or whatever. So I think people are proud. They're proud to be Americans. They're proud to be Italian Americans. And I think it's that aspect of it that they're both. And especially later generations, there are probably still people coming. In fact, we do know some Italians living here in Columbus who came for work, highly, doctors and people in chemical, working for Columbus companies. They're highly educated, but they love being in Columbus. And they're still Italian citizens, but they have pretty much moved here permanently. I don't know that they go back. Their children are bilingual. They're bicultural. I think it is something that's still a part of our city and will continue to be forever.
And I'm going to go back to kind of the history of St. John the Baptist Italian Catholic Church, why that was so special. That's kind of the centerpiece, as far as I'm concerned, on the Italian population in Columbus, Ohio. John Marzetti, who was not the Marzetti dressing, but the Marzetti food, the Johnny Marzetti, that was him. He was a realtor and had purchased much land all over the city of Columbus, including where St. John the Baptist is currently. His way to incorporate the Italian population was to give them this land so they could build a church. Because before that, the Italians coming to this country actually went to the cathedral, St. Joseph Cathedral, still there, beautifully sandblasted about 5 years ago. And they would pray under the once baptistry. And it was the picture of St. John the Baptist on the stained glass window, gorgeously done. And the Italians some of them would come and live in the church. They would hide and abide, and that was their dwelling. They had nowhere else to go. And the Catholic Church was welcoming. So with that love of St. John the Baptist and with that love of the Italian community, now people are getting to know one another. John Marzetti gave the land to build the church, and the Italians built the church themselves. There was no hired construction. So everyone got together and put that church on the map. So that was the beginning of the relationships. And again, you have so many coming from their own regions. As I said, the Abruzzi region, the Calabria regions, various areas that make you proud. And they're like little states, no different than if you're going from Alabama, Georgia, Maine, whatever. It's the same idea. And you have that pride. And that's what's so beautiful even now at St. John the Baptist. Tends to be a little bit more Introdacqua, Abruzzi region. There's many others, but that's kind of the home of it. And that's really where the relationships have stepped. I have two grandfathers. One would be considered an artist because he did ironwork around the city, still standing today. When he came to this town on Glenwood Avenue, he put together a iron workshop, and he and my dad worked there. My dad, after high school at Aquinas High School, would go into work there. My grandfather would be there. And we're going to get into how that was so important soon, how that fit into the city of Columbus. My other grandfather, as you mentioned earlier, was the fruit. 9 years old, he quit school, works. 16 years old, he is opening his first bakery, 16, 17 years old. Now, what 17-year-old is going to do that? Going to go to bed every night and get up early at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and bake, and maybe with one other person. So he learned this trade and then went ahead and put together this bakery. So the tradition was, in the small villages, on the wedding days, they would have what was called the Grand March. And there was a particular march. You see a little bit of it in The Godfather. Kind of a beautiful part of The Godfather is just gorgeous. It's so true. But they would have a march. And my grandfather brought that to America from his father, and made that happen in Columbus. At those early days, my grandfather was known as the Grand March King. All the Italians would come to our bakery to get the wedding cake that was decorated by my uncle and my grandfather. And then later my dad kind of played both sides. He was working for his father, married my mother, daughter of the bakery, and my dad got into doing all the cake decorating, again, making those wonderful cakes. So that's part of the tradition. My grandfather, being the artist in Italy, then also came here to do gorgeous ironwork and brought that talent to the city of Columbus, as well as music. My grandfather, Joseph Masdea, was a musician in Italy, a trumpet player. And he came here to America, noticed in Columbus, Ohio, there wasn't a municipal band like there would be the small band we mentioned at the marching down the wedding path in The Godfather. So he put together a band here in Columbus, and that was the Columbus Municipal Band. And they would play at Goodale Park every Sunday. They would play for events, St. John the Baptist Catholic Church. So I have the wedding side and I have the music side. So it put together this kind of beautiful celebration, because the Italians are celebrators. They are love of love. They love of people. To villainize us and to look at Christopher the way they have to understand our history. You have to understand what Christopher was about. And the religion is a key point with Christopher Columbus.